All right, SpaceX is trying something pretty wild, trying to land a rocket booster right back on the launch tower using those chopstick arms we've seen in the renders. They are calling this the sixth flight test of Starship. We have gotten our hands on SpaceX's pre-launch briefing. It's
Mhm.
super detailed, timelines, objectives, even the countdown. So it will be like we're right there in mission control.
I think what's really fascinating about this, though, is what it means for the future of space travel. If we can land rockets like airplanes, imagine how much cheaper and easier access to space would be.
So let's talk about what they're hoping to achieve with this sixth flight test. Obviously, they want to land that super heavy booster back on the tower, but there is more to it than just that, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
They also want to relight Starship's engines in space,
Yeah.
which might not sound like a big deal, but it's a huge step towards reaching orbit and coming back. It opens up a lot of possibilities for longer missions.
Makes sense. So they're not just focused on coming back to Earth, they also want to be able to get to orbit and beyond. Now, this isn't their first booster catch. They landed one during the fifth flight test. So what makes this one more ambitious?
The fifth test was a big accomplishment, but this time they've upgraded the booster a lot, added things like redundant systems for propulsion, reinforced the structure. They're really trying to increase reliability.
And safety.
Redundancy, that's good.
Don't
So
you?
they're beefing up the booster, but they're also being much more careful about when they'll try to catch it. Stricter criteria this time. And they're making it clear that they'll abort the catch if anything seems off.
Yeah, safety is the biggest thing. So if the criteria aren't met, the booster will splash down on the Gulf of Mexico. They're not going to take any unnecessary risks, especially with public safety in mind.
Speaking of splashdowns, the Starship upper stage will also splash down.
Right.
But eventually they want to catch that too, so why not go for both this time? Well, gotta learn to walk before you run, right?
Right.
Catching the booster is super complicated, and getting that right is the priority. Catching the upper stage will need even more advanced technology, so they're tackling that later.
Gotcha. They're taking it one step at a time, laying the foundation. Now, let's talk about the flight path for the Starship upper stage. It's a similar suborbital trajectory as the last test, but this time with the in-space engine relight we mentioned. Why is that so important?
This is what makes it really interesting, you see, to get to orbit
Yeah.
and do all the things you need to do in space. Starship has to fire its engines multiple times. Think about it. Adjusting course, slowing down to land on another planet. You need to be able to control the engines in space.
So it's like a test run, proving that it can do more than just go up and down.
Oh, yeah.
Now, they're also doing some cool experiments with the heat shield on the upper stage. And this might sound a little crazy. They're removing some of the heat shield tiles.
Sounds crazy, but they have a reason. By removing tiles in certain areas, they can see how the structure beneath behaves when it gets super hot during re-entry. This data is super valuable for designing a reusable heat shield, which is really important for making space travel cheaper and better.
So, they're really testing things to the limit. They're also going to be testing how well the flaps can be controlled during reentry.
Yep. They're going to fly the ship at a steeper angle during descent, basically. This means they're pushing those big flaps on the sides of Starship, seeing how they hold up against the air, gathering data, and figuring out what the control systems can really do.
Wow, that's going to be an interesting ride. Now, they've planned this test so the upper stage re-enters over the Indian Ocean during the day. Why is that?
They want to see what's happening. Daylight gives them a much better view. They'll be able to see how Starship behaves during re-entry. Plus, hopefully we'll get some awesome footage.
Okay, so we've talked about their big goals for this flight, the upgrades to the booster, and the experiments planned for the upper stage. Now, what about the countdown? What should we be watching for?
About an hour and 15 minutes before launch, they're going to do a poll with all the teams, make sure everyone's ready to load the propellant. That's when things get really interesting.
Propellant loading, or, as I like to call it, filling the rocket with spicy go juice. Always exciting. What are some of the other important moments in the countdown?
Well, about 49 minutes before liftoff, those huge tanks start getting filled with liquid oxygen and methane. They have to load it at the right temperature and pressure to make sure the launch is safe. And then, about 19 minutes before launch, they'll start chilling down the Raptor engines on both the booster and the Starship.
Engine chills, why is that step important?
We gotta get those engines ready. The temperature changes during ignition and flight are intense. The Raptor engines are incredibly powerful. They need to be in perfect shape to handle all that stress.
It's amazing how many things need to work together to launch a rocket. So, what happens once the propellant is loaded and the engines are chilled?
About 30 seconds to go, the flight director gives the final go. Go for launch. That's the moment everyone's been waiting for. Then things happen fast. Flame deflectors activate, the Raptors start igniting, and liftoff.
I bet the energy in that room is incredible.
Hmm.
So, Starship takes off, climbs through the atmosphere. Then there's that moment when things get really intense.
Yeah, max Q. But a minute after liftoff, Starship reaches max Q.
Right.
It's the point where there's the most stress in the air. It's putting the structure and all the systems to the test.
Then what happens?
About 2.5 minutes in, the Super Heavy's engines shut off. And we see that incredible separation of the two stages.
So the booster heads back to the launch tower, aiming for that epic catch. And the Starship upper stage keeps going up. What happens to the upper stage then?
Here's where things get really cool. They're going to try hot staging, which means the Starship's engines start while the booster is still attached. This is all about efficiency, making the most of the launch.
Wait, they light the upper stage's engines before the booster is gone. That sounds insanely difficult.
It takes a lot of precision. That's what makes Starship such a game changer.
This is mind-blowing, and we're just getting started.
We're just getting started. It gets even more interesting as we follow the upper stage and find out what happens during re-entry and landing.
This is where we have to leave you hanging for now. Don't worry. We'll be back with part 2 to continue this wild SpaceX adventure. Keep those imaginations firing. All right, so we left off with Starship climbing through the atmosphere just after the Super Heavy boosters separated and started heading back towards the launch tower.
It all happens so fast. But remember, while the booster's going for that landing, the Starship upper stage is still on its own journey, with a lot of challenges ahead.
Right. You mentioned hot staging, where they ignite the upper stage's engines while it's still attached to the booster. Can you explain why they do that?
It's all about efficiency, really. By firing those engines early, they avoid wasting time just coasting. It's like a head start, which saves fuel and time, both super important for longer, more complex missions.
So it's like a seamless transition from the booster to the upper stage. They're really squeezing every bit of performance out of this thing.
It's pretty remarkable. It shows how dedicated SpaceX is to pushing the limits of rocket technology.
Okay, so the upper stage is on its way, powered by its own Raptor engines. Where is it going?
Well, this is still a suborbital flight test, so it won't actually reach orbit this time. It'll go up really high, over 100 kilometers, and then come back down, splashing down in the Indian Ocean.
Still a pretty impressive trip. But it's not just about going up and down. There are some important maneuvers and experiments they're doing.
Right. Oh, yeah. This test is packed with objectives. One of the most important is that in-space engine relight. While the upper stage is coming back down, they're going to try to restart one of the Raptor engines.
Right. We talked about that before, but why is it such a big deal?
Think about it. If you want to go to orbit or further, you need to be able to fire those engines multiple times to adjust your path or to slow down for re-entry. This test proves that those engines can restart in space.
So, it's a reliability test, making sure those engines are ready for anything. Now, what about those heat shield tiles they removed? What are they hoping to learn from that?
It's about understanding how that heat shield behaves. When it gets super hot during re-entry, they're aiming for a fully reusable heat shield, which means it has to survive multiple trips through the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive. Removing parts of a heat shield.
And lets them see how the structure underneath handles the heat.
Right. So they're basically creating a weak spot on purpose to see what happens.
Yeah, you could say that. The data they get will help them design better heat shields in the future.
Okay. And they're also testing those big flaps during re-entry, stressing the limits. What exactly does that mean?
They're going to fly the upper stage at a steeper angle, basically, putting more pressure on those flaps. Those flaps are super important for controlling Starship, especially during re-entry. So they need to know how they'll perform when things get rough.
It's all about pushing the boundaries, making sure Starship can handle anything. Now, let's talk about the future of Starship. What kind of upgrades are they planning?
SpaceX has some big plans. One thing is improving those flaps. We've talked about how important they are. So they're working on new designs that'll give them even more control.
So they'll be able to land even more precisely.
Exactly. And eventually catch the upper stage, too.
That's going to be something else. What other upgrades are in the works?
Well, they're looking at making the propellant tanks bigger on both the booster and the upper stage. Bigger tanks mean more fuel, which means they can go further, carry more stuff.
That opens up so many possibilities.
Right. And to make sure those longer missions are possible. They're also working on new heat shield tiles that can withstand even higher temperatures.
It's that they're constantly making it better. It feels like we're at the beginning of a new era of space travel. But, It's not just about the technology, is it? There are bigger questions we need to consider. What does this mean for humanity's future in space?
You're absolutely right. We're talking about routine access to orbit, lunar bases,
Yeah.
missions to Mars, maybe even beyond. It raises all sorts of questions.
Let's start with scientific research. How could Starship change the way we explore the universe?
Imagine sending entire labs to Mars, not just rovers. We could study the geology in detail, search for signs of past life, even build permanent research stations.
Wow. And what about those icy moons, like Europa and Enceladus?
Yeah, those are fascinating. Starship could definitely help us get there. With its payload capacity and reusability, we could explore those subsurface oceans, maybe even find evidence of life.
That would be incredible. It's not just about science, though. What about space tourism? Could Starship make that more affordable?
I think so. If launches become cheaper, more people could experience space. Imagine taking a trip to orbit, seeing Earth from above.
Sounds pretty amazing. And then there's asteroid mining.
Right. Starship could make that a reality. It could transport equipment and people back and forth.
Yeah.
We could tap into the resources on those asteroids.
Which could lead to all sorts of new industries and technologies.
Dude,
But
globally.
with all these possibilities comes some big challenges, too, right?
Of course, we have to be careful. One of the biggest challenges is sustainability. We don't want to create a bunch of space junk or damage other planets. We have to be responsible.
Right. We need to be good stewards of space.
And we have to think about the ethical side of things. How do we make sure everyone benefits from space exploration, not just a few wealthy individuals or countries?
So it's about making sure this new era of space travel is beneficial for all of humanity. And it's not just about governments anymore. Private companies like SpaceX are playing a huge role.
It's a really exciting time.
Hmm.
Before we get too carried away thinking about the future, let's not forget about the drama that's unfolding right now. That booster is trying to land. The upper stage is doing its thing. The whole world is watching.
The tension is building. We'll be back in part 3 to break it all down and talk about what it all means for the future of space travel.
Well, we've made it to the final part of our deep dive into SpaceX and Starship. It's been a pretty amazing journey.
It has. From the technical details of this flight test to the bigger picture of what Starship could mean for space exploration.
We've talked about the engineering, the ambition, the whole vision, but now it's time to step back and ask, what does it all mean? What does the success of Starship, a fully reusable spacecraft, mean for the future of humans in space?
That's the big question, isn't it? The one that's driven us for centuries. The possibilities are huge. Imagine routine trips to orbit, lunar bases, missions to Mars, maybe even further. Okay, let's start with scientific research. How could Starship change the way we explore and study the universe?
Well, think about sending big advanced labs to Mars, not just rovers. We could study the geology up close, look for signs of ancient life, maybe even set up permanent research outposts.
Like a whole new chapter in our understanding of the universe. And what about those icy moons? Like Europa and Enceladus?
Those are really interesting. With Starship, we could actually send missions to the outer solar system. Imagine exploring those subsurface oceans, looking for signs of life.
That would be incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not just about science, right? What about space tourism? Could Starship make that a reality for more people?
I think it could. If the cost of launches goes down, space tourism becomes more affordable. More people could experience space firsthand, see Earth from orbit.
It would be an amazing experience. And then there's the potential for things like asteroid mining.
Right. Starship could be the key to unlocking the resources in those asteroids. Imagine the possibilities.
New industries, new technologies.
Totally.
But all these possibilities come with some big challenges too, right?
Absolutely. We have to be very careful. One of the biggest challenges is making sure everything we do is sustainable. We don't want to pollute space with junk or damage other planets.
So we need to be responsible.
We need to consider the ethical implications. How do we make sure that everyone benefits from space exploration, not just a few countries or companies?
It's about ensuring that this new era of space travel is good for all of humanity.
Exactly.
It's also interesting to think about the role of private companies like SpaceX. They're playing a huge part in all of this.
It's a really exciting time to see this level of innovation and investment.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left feeling a sense of wonder and excitement, but also a sense of responsibility.
I agree. We have this incredible opportunity to explore the universe, to make new discoveries, but we have to do it the right way.
So what do we do now? What's the next step?
I think the next step is to keep pushing the boundaries, keep innovating, keep asking questions, support the people who are making this happen, and inspire the next generation of explorers.
Because the future of space exploration is in our hands. It's up to us to decide what kind of future we want to create.
Well said.
That wraps up our deep dive into SpaceX, Starship, and the sixth flight test. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep looking up.